it is my great pleasure to present to you Professor Milton Friedman on the subject Equality and Freedom in the Free Enterprise System. Professor Friedman.
What I am going to talk to you about tonight is a topic that is of extraordinary topical importance, but also of great subtlety, philosophically and in every other way. The belief that government has both the responsibility and the power to promote equality of income has become an article of religious faith. It takes about as much daring these days to question the virtues of egalitarianism as it used to take to question the virtues of motherhood. I trust that just as it no longer takes that much courage these days to question the virtues of motherhood, the time may come when an even greater degree of understanding about the problems of equality will make it less dangerous to question the virtues of the religious belief in equality. Like most religious beliefs, and the reason why it is to be called a religious belief, this one is unexamined and preached rather more than it is practiced. In this talk tonight, I want to discuss first the various meanings that are attributed to the concept of equality and the ambiguities which each of them have. Second, the relation between the value of egalitarianism or equality on the one hand and such other values as efficiency, justice, and liberty. And third, some of the facts about the distribution of income and about the effects of government measures that have been taken in the name of promoting equality. It is appropriate in this place to start with perhaps the most famous of all declarations about equality. This is in some ways the root meaning of the concept of equality. You all recall that Thomas Jefferson, when he wrote the Declaration of Independence, wrote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." If you were to stop there and think about those words, you would say, well, what utter nonsense. How can any man as intelligent, as knowledgeable, as worldly as Thomas Jefferson write such an obviously invalid sentence? Not only aren't all men created equal, all people aren't men. And what about the women? Thomas Jefferson, like so many of his fellows, was a slave owner. Was he asserting that the slaves were created equal to the non-slaves? Some men are born tall, some are short, some are strong, some are weak, some are smart, some are stupid. But obviously, Thomas Jefferson did not mean that men are created equal in the literal sense, that they are clones of one another. That isn't what he meant. And that becomes obvious if you don't stop the reading of the Declaration of Independence at that point, but go on to read the sentences that follow. And what follows that statement in the Declaration of Independence, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal," it continues, "that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." What Thomas Jefferson and the Founding Fathers were saying when they said all men are created equal is not at all an assertion about their genetic composition or their physical characteristics. It was rather an assertion that they were equal before the law, that they were equal in the eyes of God, that each person is precious in and of himself, that each person separately is to be taken seriously as a human being in and of himself, and is not to be treated simply as a means for the purpose of serving somebody else's ends. Equality, even in that sense, of course, the Founding Fathers were preaching what they were not practicing, as they were well aware, because that concept of equality was, of course, inconsistent with slavery. And the working out of the logic of the Declaration of Independence ultimately had to lead to the abolition of slavery, because it did violate this fundamental concept of equality. Equality as human beings before the law and before the Creator. Now, equality of rights in this sense gets meaning precisely because people are not equal in tastes, in values, in capacities. It's precisely because people are not equal that we have to stress that people have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Because people are unequal and different, each will view his happiness as lying in a different area. Each will have different values. He will hold different things high. And if each separately is to be regarded as an end in himself, it is essentially necessary that he be given the opportunity to pursue those differences and to satisfy his tastes and values and not somebody else. Equality in this sense, equality of rights, personal equality, is a precondition of permitting human freedom. That's the original, I believe, and the most important sense of equality. But there are two other senses which it has been given, which need attention. The second, the most widely discussed sense of equality is the notion of equality of opportunity. All of us are accustomed to saying, well, of course, men aren't equal, but they should run a fair race. We want people to have equality of opportunity. Now, in any literal sense, that's just as impossible as is physical genetic equality. I have one child who is born with sight, and another child who is born blind. What can it mean to say that they shall have equality of opportunity? Their opportunities are unequal. I have children who are born in the United States of America, a great country, a wealthy country with many openings. I have children who are born, let us say, in India, or in China, or in Russia, or in any one of a dozen other places in the world. What can it possibly mean to say that their opportunities are equal? Within a single country, some children are lucky enough to have parents who are concerned about them, who give them a background of culture and understanding and schooling and education. Other children are born so unfortunate as not to have the same quality of parents. There is no way in any literal sense you can achieve equality of opportunity. And yet, the concept has a meaning and a significance. What we really mean by it, I believe, is not the literal sense that people shall have equal opportunities, because that's impossible. What we really mean is something else. It's the idea that is expressed best by the French phrase that became common at the time of the French Revolution. I won't give it to you in French because my French pronunciation is so terrible I would mangle it. But the English of it is a career open to the talents. that every career shall be open to every individual who shall have the talent and the ability and the good fortune to have had the upbringing which would qualify him for it. The meaning of equality of opportunity in this sense is that there shall be no arbitrary obstacles placed to prevent people from achieving those careers, those positions, those opportunities for which they have the ability and the capacity and the taste to qualify. In that sense, equality of opportunity, as we shall see, is also a necessary condition for freedom, in the sense that there shall be no arbitrary obstacles preventing people from developing their capacities. But I come to the third sense, and the one which is the one most widely used today, and that's the notion of equality in the sense of equality of outcome. This is what is meant when people say, we want a society in which inequalities of income are less, in which differences in wealth, differences in goods and services available are less. Now, equality of income, equality of outcome, is clearly inconsistent and contradictory to equality of opportunity of the kind we've just been talking about. Let me illustrate that in a rather silly and trivial way. A group of us get together to play a game of poker. Equality of outcome means that after the game is over, you have to redistribute the money so everybody ends with the same amount. Well, that takes all the fun out of the game. And it also completely denies the idea that at the outset everybody shall have the opportunity to do the best he can. If everybody is to end up in the same place, to have the same outcome after the event, what does it mean to say that people shall have equality of opportunity to achieve as much as they can in terms of their capacities? So equality of outcome, is clearly inconsistent with any appropriate concept of equality of opportunity. But beyond that, it is an even more difficult concept to define precisely than are the other concepts, equality of rights or equality of opportunity in the sense of no arbitrary obstacles. If we're going to talk about equality of income, what is the appropriate area? Should we talk about the world as a whole? Are people who say we cannot tolerate inequalities of income saying we shall see to it that the objective, that the aim ought to be to have every person around the world have the same income as every other person? Do you want to do it if not for the world as a whole? Is it to be equality within a country, within a state, within a city, within a family? How do you know when two people have equal incomes? What does that mean? Here is one man whose tastes and preferences are to lie under a tree and enjoy himself. And he will choose a job which will give him that opportunity even though it has a much lower reward than another man who is a workaholic and wants to work hard, and besides he likes those things you can get with money. Under what circumstances do they have equal income? Are you going to say they have equal income if they have equal money? Indeed, do we not require under many, many circumstances that money incomes shall be different in order that the whole of people's returns be the same? I want to induce somebody to do a dirty, nasty job, and I offer somebody else a very pleasant job. Isn't it necessary, in order that they shall be equally well off, that the one man receive a higher income in dollars, higher money income than the other. Some activities carry more risk than others. Let's go back to my lottery game. I have 1,000 beautiful girls who want to go into the movies. Where do I measure equality of income? One of them is going to become a star and make $1 million, and the other are going to have very low incomes. But they all start off equal. How do I measure when are they equal in income? And how do I compare their income with the other 1,000 equally beautiful girls who decided to become secretaries? What unit do I want to take if I'm going to measure equality of income? Do I want to look at the person as a unit, the family? Here I have two families. Both, husband and wife, the one decided that they would prefer to have children, and the other decided that they would prefer to have a nice automobile. What measures equality of income? Equality per person or per family? Now, lest you think that this problem of the size of family is an irrelevant consideration, let me point out to you that probably no change in the past 75 years has done more to reduce real poverty and real misery than the change in the size of the family over that period, and particularly the elimination of very large families. If you go back to the social surveys that were being made at the turn of the century, you will find that the real cases of poverty were the cases of families which had a very large number of families of relatively low income, which had a very large number of children. If I had two families, both had the parents and the father, let's say, in both cases had the same job, earning the same number of dollars per week, then one family might be relatively well off because it was small, while the other family was poverty-stricken because it was undesirably large. And the changing technology, which has enabled families to choose the size that they prefer and to plan their families, has probably been about more important than any other single change in the past 75 years in reducing the incidence of real poverty and misery. But the problems are only beginning. Do I want to look at the equality of incomes on a day-by-day basis, on a week-by-week basis, on a month-by-month basis, on a year-by-year basis, on a life-by-life basis? We have baseball players whose working season is very short. They only work during 5 or 6 months of the year, and then, as some of you may know, they, in many states, collect unemployment insurance in the rest of the year. Do I say that in the first 6 months of the year their income is higher than that of the people in general, and in the last 6 months it's lower? Surely I want to look at it on a year basis. But here are all you youngsters in school. If I construct the usual kind of a distribution of income on a person-by-person basis, each one of you will enter in as one at a relatively low income, along with your parents who will enter in at a relatively high income. But that's a silly comparison, because you may have a low income now, but you are destined to have a high income later on. If I'm going to make comparisons about equality of income, I surely have to make comparisons over a longer period. I may say that I am only touching the surface of all the difficulties and ambiguities involved in the concept of equality of outcome, and I do not pretend to be giving you a comprehensive survey. My purpose is very different. As I said at the outset, religious beliefs have the characteristic that they tend to be unexamined. And that is the case with this concept of equality. We have many, many people preaching the religion of equality. They haven't even thought, they haven't begun to examine what do they mean by the equality of output. What would they regard as an equal incomes? How would they take account of all of these different items I am talking about? I want to turn from that to the next question, the question about the relation between equality in this sense of equality of outcome and other values that we hold. Because while people might say, gee, I'd like to see a more equal distribution of incomes, we might find that lovely, we might find it pleasing. All of us will also say, but after all, we have other values. We would also like to see people have high incomes. We want not only equality, but we want an adequate level of income. And so we have to ask, how does equality relate to efficiency? We also want to have not only equality, but also justice. How does equality relate to justice? We also want to have not only equality, but human freedom. How are those related? And I want to turn now to the question of these relationships. The title that was suggested had the words free enterprise in the title. I haven't referred to that yet, but it comes into the picture at this point. If we discuss the relationship between equality and efficiency. Because the free market, a system of voluntary cooperation among people through the market, achieves efficiency in the utilization of resources only if the people who operate in that market are paid, receive a reward in accordance with their contribution to the total output. This is not the place for a full discussion of the concept of a market and of how it operates. But the key principle is very clear. The role of a market and of the price system is, first of all, to transmit information so that everybody involved in this market can know what services are valued and relatively how they are valued. That's the function, one function of prices. If the price of something rises, the price of blue jeans, that transmits information that people prefer blue jeans to other things. And that's the first role of the price system, is to transmit information. But you have, it's not enough to transmit information. You have to be able to act in accordance with the information. And the second role of the price system is to provide an incentive to producers to act in accordance with the information. It's to enable the people, Levi Strauss, who produces the blue jeans, to say, oh, we got to produce some more blue jeans. We better buy some more material, and we better hire some more labor, and we better get more machines. And from that point of view, the role of the price system is to have them figure out the cheapest way to produce those extra blue jeans. And they do that by seeing what the price of the material and the manpower is and adding it up. But in the third place, what incentive is there for people to act on the basis of this information? The fact that they are being rewarded in accordance with what they produce. Here is the information, the signal has gone out that the society would like to have some more blue jeans. And here's a man whose greatest skill, he's very skilled in making blue jeans, but he's now perfectly happy doing something else. Why should he move? Well, the price system leads him to move. If he is rewarded, if he gets an income in accordance with the value of what he produces. In that case, he can get a higher income by going and producing blue jeans than he can get by wherever he is now. So, a free market will produce efficiency only insofar as those who cooperate in the free market are paid in accordance with the value of what they add in the market, according to their product. Payment in accordance with product is a principle that is absolutely essential to achieve efficiency in a free market. Now, equality and this principle of efficiency does not bear a one-way relationship. There are some measures which will promote both equality and efficiency. The concept of equality in the sense of a career open to the talents, in the sense that there shall be no obstacles, no arbitrary obstacles. The removal of such obstacles will promote both efficiency and equality. If I have had the rule that only people who are born from certain classes in society shall be able to hold certain classes of jobs, and that's an arbitrary obstacle, the removal of that obstacle will promote both equality by giving greater opportunity to a wider class of people, and efficiency by enabling people to use their resources more efficiently and more effectively than they otherwise could. But those government measures that reduce the relationship between reward and output interfere with efficiency. They destroy the incentive for people to use resources most effectively. If for every extra dollar you produce, 50 or 60 cents of it is going to Washington or to the state capitol or the city hall, well, then you don't quite have the same incentive to undertake the efforts involved to earn that. So the relationship between equality and efficiency is a complex one. Those measures that widen equality of opportunity will promote efficiency. Those that introduce a difference between product and reward will reduce efficiency. The same thing is true about the relationship between equality and justice. Justice is in the eye of the beholder. There is no absolute standard of justice. There is no way to define justice. One man's notion of justice is not the same as another man's notion of justice. My great teacher, Frank Knight, used to say, he died years ago, but he was a great man, and many of us are much in his debt, and he used to say, you know what's going to destroy this world? It's going to be the search for justice. Now that seems like a paradox, but it is not a paradox at all. Because if justice were self-evident and identical to everybody, there would be no problem. But the point is that if I am going to put justice above everything, then the only way that can work out is through a war among alternative meanings of justice. It's almost impossible to agree about justice, but you can come closer to agreeing about what is clear injustice. And here it's easier to agree about how to avoid clear injustice. And here, equality of treatment, equality of outcome, is sometimes required in order to avoid injustice. It is unjust for two people who are essentially in the same position to be treated differently. Equals should be treated equally. And that kind of injustice can only be avoided by equality. However, equality may also conflict. It is unjust if a thief and his victim are treated equally. Unequal treatment is needed for justice. It is unjust for a lazy man and a hard worker to be rewarded equally. Justice there requires difference. But the most important conflict, and the one I really want to stress, because I believe it is a fundamental one, is the conflict between equality and liberty, or the possible conflict. Here again, as I say, equality in the sense of no arbitrary obstacles. Equality in the sense of equality before the law, in Thomas Jefferson's sense, is a precondition for freedom and liberty. But imposed equality of outcome clearly conflicts with liberty. You can bring that out most clearly by taking the extreme case. Suppose everybody was going to end up having the same amount of goods and services regardless of what happened. Everybody was going to have the same amount of food, the same amount of clothing, the same amount of housing. How would it be decided who would do what work? How do you, under those circumstances, allocate jobs? Who sweeps the streets? Who directs the traffic? Who teaches the classes? Who flies the airplanes? If everybody's going to end up being exactly equal, you're not going to have very many volunteers for sweeping streets. And I suspect there might be one or two other jobs for which you would not have many volunteers. It is obvious that if everybody is going to end up equally, then only coercion and force, order, command, could assign people to jobs. But then what happens to the equality you started with? Is the man who gives orders equal to the man who takes the orders? Are you not in that wonderful position that George Orwell described so well in Animal Farm, in which everybody is equal, but some are more equal than others? Perfect equality is a myth. And if you could conceive of it in any way, it would be utterly inconsistent with liberty. But we don't have to go to that extreme case. There's a wonderful book by Bob Nozick which deals with the case of equality and anarchy. And he gives a simple example to illustrate this point that I think is very effective. He says, let's suppose hypothetically we started out with a situation in which everybody was absolutely equal in terms of income. Everybody had the same number of dollars of income, and for a moment we begged the question of who does what. And he says, but you know, and this is a good auditorium in which to mention this, there's one great basketball player, let's say, to go back a little ways, Wilt Chamberlain. And lots of people would love to see him play basketball. And they all get together and they decide they'll chip in a quarter apiece to make up a purse in order to persuade him to play basketball. He's perfectly willing to play basketball if he gets that amount of money, but if he doesn't get paid at all, why should he bother? Now, if you're going to maintain an equal society, you've got to prevent people from doing that. That's a violation of equality, because after the game is played, it's like after the poker game or after the lottery, people will no longer be equal. Again, from another point of view, you see that equality and liberty really conflict very sharply. That you cannot achieve complete equality without utterly destroying liberty, without destroying freedom. That inequality of outcome, the final product, is in many cases the other side of freedom. Now, once you put it this way, it becomes absolutely clear that, you know, people don't really want equality of outcome. That's a bunch of nonsense. People may talk as if they want equality of outcome, as if they are egalitarians, but nobody believes it. Is there anybody who really says that you ought to prohibit people completely from participating in lotteries? Well, lotteries are illegal in one form or another in many states. Mistakenly so, I believe. But there are lotteries and lotteries. I've already suggested that the young women who seek a career on the stage or in the movies are engaged in a lottery. People who go into a business which may yield them a lot of money or in which they may go broke, they're engaged in a lottery. People who buy stocks in the New York Stock Exchange are engaged in a lottery. Some people are going to win, some are going to lose. And everybody goes in with his eyes open, knowing he may win or he may lose, of course. We all grossly overestimate our own chances of winning. That's natural human optimism. If it weren't for that, Reno and Las Vegas would be ghost towns. But yet, do we really want to say that we want to have a world in which it is impossible for people to undertake lotteries? If the people who preached equality really wanted equality, there is nothing in the world that would prevent each one of them achieving the objective himself. If he thinks you ought to have equality in the country as a whole, the statistics are available for him to figure out the average income every man in the country has, on the average. And if he has more than that, for him to take the excess and distribute it. He will be achieving equality. He will be making his own contribution to equality. If he believes that what you ought to have is equality world over, well, then he could keep $75 or $100 or $200 a year for himself and give the rest around the world to deserving objects of charity. Indeed, the thing that impresses me most about the people who preach equality is that the new class that is the most ardent, that are the most ardent preachers of equality, aren't doing badly for themselves in this unequal world. And of course, this is one of the major problems, one of the major reasons they preach it. Because the doctrine of equality has proved a very potent means for producing good jobs. But maybe people might say, well, I believe in equality, but I don't want to be the only person to do it. I don't want to just cut down my income to equal the others. The world will still be an unequal world. Well, then he has the alternative of going and living in an egalitarian community. There are some small numbers of people around this world who have gone to live in communes. They ought to be perfectly free to do it, provided they don't try to make us live in a commune with them. And so if those people who preach equality really believe in it, there's nothing to prevent them from going there. I owe to the gentleman I mentioned before, Bob Nozick, a bit of really very nice empirical evidence that people don't really want equality. And that is that we have in one country in the world very equal socialistic communes which people can enter voluntarily and which are highly regarded, namely the kibbutzim in Israel. Now, the kibbutzim in Israel are egalitarian communities. They are communities in which all people are jointly involved in the kibbutz, in that particular community. They all share equally in the output. They all share equally in the work. They decide by joint meeting who shall do what, etc. It's the closest approach to a purely socialistic community you could possibly imagine. Moreover, unlike the situation in the United States, those communities are not looked down on. On the contrary, they are highly respected and regarded. They have great social standing. Everybody is free to join a kibbutz or to leave it. They have been viable social organizations, but at no time, and certainly not today, have more than 5% or so of the people voluntarily entered in and joined into the community. So we can make the empirical inference that about 5% of the people in any society would voluntarily choose equality versus diversity and opportunity. Now, what are the facts? The people who preach equality, if they heard what I said or listened to me say, would say, well, what you're saying is very well. But they would say to me, how can you stand up there and talk this way when you know that the problem isn't equality, the problem is inequality. The problem is that capitalist societies are wicked and inequitable societies in which the rich grind the poor under their heels. Now, the interesting thing is that the facts are precisely the other way around. The facts are that free market, competitive capitalist societies produce less inequality than any other societies in the world. That they are by all odds the most equal societies. If you go to a country like the Soviet Union, which is very far from a free market society, although it has some free market elements, the differences between the level of living of the people at the top and at the bottom are far greater than the differences between the level of living of the people at the top and the bottom of a society such as our own. Those differences in level of living are associated with enormous differences in power over the lives of other people. But forget about those differences in power, forget about the restraints on liberty, just look in terms of the way in which they live. Read a book like Hedrick Smith's book on the Russians about the difference between the standard of life of the privileged upper classes and of the great masses. And if you don't want to do that, look at the statistics. The income of a foreman in a Russian factory is higher relative to the income of an ordinary worker than the income of a foreman in the United States in an American factory. If you look in a country like the United States, and you look at these statistical distributions of income that are put out, that 10% of the people at the top get 30% of the income and 10% of the people at the bottom get 2% of the income, and you look underneath that to the basic elements that account for that inequality, you will find that most measured inequality in the United States is due to things like differences in age, differences in family size, differences in level of education. If you eliminate these sources of differences among people, you account for the greater part of the differences. Moreover, the more successful a capitalist society is, the better. Industrial development, mechanical improvement, all of the great wonders of the modern age have done relatively little for the people at the very top of the income scale. Modern plumbing didn't mean a thing to the really wealthy people in ancient Rome. They had running water. It was carried in the hands of servants, but it was running. It didn't do them any good to be able to turn a tap. Television, radio that has brought what some people regard as entertainment to millions of others. The patricians in Roman society, they could get the best artists in their society to come into their homes for them. No, the great achievements and improvements of Western capitalism have redounded primarily to the benefit of the ordinary man on the street. They have primarily made available to the masses the luxuries that before that were available only to the classes. In 1848, John Stuart Mill, great English economist and philosopher, in a book called The Principles of Economics, wrote, and I quote, "Hitherto," he wrote, "it is questionable if all the mechanical inventions yet made has lightened the day's toil of any human being. They have enabled a greater population to live the same life of drudgery and imprisonment, and an increased number of manufacturers and others to make fortunes. They have increased the comforts of the middle classes, but they have not yet begun to effect those great changes in human destiny which it is in their nature and in their futurity to accomplish." Nobody could say that today. Had not lightened the day's toil of any human being? You will travel from one end to the other end of the prosperous countries like the United States, where capitalism has brought mechanical invention, and the only people you will find engaging in hard day's toil are those who are doing it for sport. If you want to find people really working hard, you have to go to the countries where capitalism has not yet come, to the backward countries. You have to go to places where people are still breaking the ground with a pick. They are still doing it. I go back to Thomas Jefferson, whom I started with. I once went through Monticello, his estate here near Charlottesville, and in going through Monticello, the guide tells you how many household servants he had. I took that figure, and I used it to estimate how much a person would have to spend today to be able to command the full-time services of as many people as Thomas Jefferson commanded for his consumption. I don't mean directly in having people around the house, but after all, if I buy a suit, somebody has worked to make that. That's the equivalent of so many days' services. And so I said, take the total amount of consumption divided by the average wages of a man, and that's the number of men that a man commands. Now, Thomas Jefferson was a well-to-do man, but he wasn't one of the most wealthy men of his times. He was upper middle class, lower upper class. There were many people like him. I no longer remember the exact number, but I remember that I calculated that for a person today to be able to command the services of as many people as he did, he would have to be able to spend on consumption something like $3 million a year. Now, the proportion of the American population that can do that is minuscule compared to the fraction of the people in Thomas Jefferson's day who were of his level of well-being. The fact is that there has been an enormous increase in equality in the United States, primarily as a result of free market capitalism. Of course, you will say to me, but what are you talking about? We haven't had free market capitalism. The government has been playing an increasing role in the last 50 years. All of these improvements you're talking about are attributable to the wise and beneficent intervention of the government in evening out the extremes of the income distribution. What about that? Well, I believe the situation is exactly the opposite. That government intervention has been a major source of inequality at both ends of the income scale. If I ask today, what are the major sources of poverty for the disadvantaged in this country? If you examine that question, you will find that the major sources, the major creator of poverty has been the U.S. government and local governments. If I take the class that is most noted, that we are likely to talk about, in what respect are the poor in the center ghettos of our big cities most disadvantaged? In what respect are the poor blacks worst off? There is no doubt what the answer is. The respect they are most disadvantaged is in the kind of schooling they can get. Why? Because the schools are run by the government. First of all, we give them a whammy in not letting them get decent training to have skills to work, and then we say, you don't have good skills, you aren't worth much in the marketplace. We want to make sure you are really not getting jobs, and so we will impose a minimum wage rate that will make sure that you're not worth anybody's while to hire. The minimum wage rate is the most anti-Negro law on the books of the United States, in my opinion, because it requires an employer to discriminate against anybody who has low skills. So our government schools give them low skills, and our government minimum wage laws deny them a job to get on-the-job training. Our government laws promote and defend the restrictive practices of trade unions, which have been another source of reduced opportunity to improve their lot on the part of low-income groups. We have a welfare system in the United States which has encouraged people to stay in the area of poverty, to become poor and to stay poor. The alleged intentions are excellent, but the actual outcome is very different from the intentions. So on the one end, governmental programs, many enacted in the name of helping the poor, have in fact been a source of poverty for the disadvantaged. At the other end, a major source of great wealth has been special government privilege. You know, if you will pardon me for touching on high and mighty subjects, there was a president of the United States who was able to retire after the end of his term to a very high income level on the basis of a family fortune founded upon the possession of a number of TV licenses. There have been very few, it's not an accident that some of the great fortunes in this country in the past 30 or 40 years have been made either in the radio and television field or in the field of oil. Because those are both areas in which the government has been granting special privilege, in the one case in the form of licenses for TV and radio stations given without charge, in the other case in the early days in the form of percentage depletion, of state pro-rationing boards, of oil import quotas, more recently in the form of entitlements, subsidies for the import of oil, and so on. If we look beyond the United States, if you go to the poorer countries of the world, to the underdeveloped countries, fortunes in those underdeveloped countries in the past decades have been primarily made through having import permits from the government privilege. So government intervention, in my opinion, has been a source of less equality, not of more. What's true of these specific measures may well be true of government redistribution via taxes. It may well be true of what we call, erroneously, our progressive income tax system. It's a system which has highly graduated rates, but which is full of special provisions so that people who are otherwise in the same position may pay vastly different taxes. It's a source of inequality and not of equality. In general, our government policies for redistribution via taxes bring back to mind the wonderful comment a century ago by William Graham Sumner in his essay on the Forgotten Man. Do you remember his comment about the society in which A and B get together to decide what C shall do for D? That's what happens here. A and B get together and decide what C, the taxpayer, the forgotten man in Sumner's account, shall do for D, the recipient. Except, you know, somehow a little bit of that money seems to slip off on A and B on the way. Most government measures that have been enacted in the name of equality, in fact, end up benefiting people like you and me in the middle and upper income classes. We are the A's and B's who try to impose on the C's burdens to help the D's, but we get our share in the way. I believe along these lines that if one goes through the discussion of egalitarianism and equality of outcome, the conclusion you come to, or that I come to, is the importance of distinguishing between two very different things. One is for 90% of us to decide that we are willing to tax ourselves to help the unfortunate 10%, to relieve distress and assure that nobody is in misery. That's one thing. I think it's a wholly different thing for 80% of us to impose taxes on one 10% in the name of benefiting the other 10%. I think it's a wholly different thing for any majority of us to redistribute income between one group and another, not to relieve misery, not to finance necessary projects, but simply because, as many of the proponents of equality will say, they find inequality unlovely. The redistribution of income, the taking from some to give to others, in order to achieve some kind of an abstract concept of equality, is comparable to cutting down the high trees in a forest to the same level as a low tree so that no tree shall stand above any other. And it seems to me wholly unjustified. I do not believe it can be regarded as just or proper or right to use policemen to take resources from some in order to give to others, just because some of us may think that our values demand greater equality. My final conclusion Any society that puts equality ahead of freedom will end up with neither equality nor freedom. Any society that puts equality before freedom will end up with neither. On the other hand, a society that puts freedom first will, as a happy byproduct, end up both with greater freedom and greater equality. It will be a byproduct, but it will not be an accident. It will not be an accident because a free society releases the energies and the abilities of people to pursue their own objectives. It thus prevents some people from arbitrarily holding down other people. It thus prevents people from achieving positions of privilege and maintaining it permanently. So a society that puts freedom first will by no accident, but as a happy byproduct, achieve, in my opinion, both greater freedom and greater equality. Thank you.